In this episode, we're going to focus on what happens after analysis, which is the moment you have to communicate attribution to the people who will make decisions based on what you say. Decision makers often do not live in log files and technical nuance, but they still need clarity about risk, impact, and what the organization should do next. Attribution is one of the hardest topics to present because it blends technical uncertainty with business and sometimes legal consequences, and it can easily become either too vague to be useful or too confident to be safe. Responsible presentation is not about refusing to discuss attribution, and it is not about dumping caveats until nobody can act. It is about giving leaders what they need to decide while protecting them from overclaiming and protecting the team from credibility damage. The way you present matters as much as what you believe, because leaders will remember your message in simplified form. The goal here is to learn how to present attribution in a way that is actionable, sober, and aligned to outcomes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A responsible attribution conversation begins with understanding why leaders ask about who did it, because their question usually represents a bundle of concerns. They may be asking about likelihood of recurrence, expected sophistication, possible motives, regulatory implications, or whether the organization is part of a broader pattern. They may also be thinking ahead to external communications, partner notifications, or board-level reporting, where a name can shape the narrative. If you answer only the literal question with an actor label, you may not address the underlying decision concerns that motivated the question. A better approach is to interpret the question as a request for decision-relevant context, and then provide attribution information as one component of that context. This is also where the distinction between linkage and identity becomes vital, because leaders may benefit from knowing the activity aligns with a recurring operational cluster even if true identity remains uncertain. When you align your response to the leader's actual decision needs, you reduce frustration and reduce pressure to overreach. The first step in presenting responsibly is to lead with what is operationally certain and decision relevant, because attribution rarely matters unless it changes action. Leaders need to know what happened, what is at risk, whether the adversary still has access, and what protective steps are underway or needed. If you begin with attribution, you risk turning the discussion into a debate about names while urgent containment and recovery decisions are still on the table. A responsible sequence is to establish the incident facts and current status, then introduce attribution as a bounded assessment that informs expectations but does not replace operational reality. This helps leaders stay anchored in what must be done regardless of who the adversary is. It also makes your message more resilient, because if attribution changes later, the operational actions you recommended remain justified. Presenting this way shows maturity, because it keeps focus on outcomes rather than headlines. Once you introduce attribution, responsible presentation means being clear about what kind of attribution you are offering, because different kinds support different decisions. Sometimes you are offering a linkage claim, meaning you believe the activity is consistent with a known cluster or pattern observed elsewhere. Sometimes you are offering a tentative hypothesis about the likely actor behind that cluster, with a stated confidence level. Sometimes you are simply describing the adversary as an operational entity without naming them, such as an actor using credential abuse and selective targeting, which can be enough to guide defense. Decision makers often do not realize these are different, so it is your job to distinguish them in plain language. You can explain that you have high confidence the activity aligns with a recurring behavior pattern and moderate confidence about who may be behind it, if that is true. You can also explain what evidence supports the linkage and what evidence is missing for stronger identity claims. This framing avoids the trap where a leader hears one label and assumes it represents complete certainty. Responsible presentation also means explaining the relevance of attribution to the decision in front of the leader, because otherwise attribution becomes trivia. If attribution suggests the adversary tends to return quickly after losing access, that might justify maintaining heightened monitoring longer. If attribution suggests the adversary focuses on credential access and lateral movement, that might justify prioritizing identity-related containment and review. If attribution suggests the adversary's typical objective is data theft rather than service disruption, that might influence which systems are prioritized for investigation and protection. The key is that you tie attribution to expected behavior, not to mythology about the actor. You are essentially saying, based on the pattern we see, these are the moves we should anticipate, and here is how that changes what we do. This makes attribution actionable, which is the only reason to discuss it during an incident. When attribution is presented as behavior expectation, it becomes a practical planning tool. Another responsible practice is to explicitly describe the downside risk of being wrong, because that helps leaders weigh how much to rely on the attribution claim. If the attribution is wrong, the organization might still be safe if the recommended actions are behavior-based and broad enough to cover similar threats. If the attribution is wrong and the organization tailors actions too narrowly, such as focusing on a single set of indicators, the organization could miss the real threat behavior. You do not need to dramatize this, but you should communicate that attribution is an assessment that can change as more evidence arrives. You can also describe how you have pressure-tested the conclusion, such as looking for disconfirming evidence or considering alternative explanations like tool sharing. This does two things. It increases trust in the analysis process, and it prevents leaders from treating the attribution as an immovable fact. Responsible presentation is not only about what you say, but about how you help leaders interpret its reliability. The way you handle questions in the moment is also part of responsible presentation, because leaders will often push for certainty when they are anxious. A leader may ask whether this is a certain actor, whether it is nation-state, or whether it is financially motivated, because those categories feel like they imply severity. The responsible move is to answer what you can support, then redirect to the behaviors and impacts that are actually observed. For example, you can say the observed behavior shows credential-focused intrusion activity and attempts to access high-value systems, which is consistent with several threat types, and that the team is acting on the behaviors rather than on a label. This keeps the leader from equating a category label with certainty about intent. It also keeps the team from being boxed into a narrative that might later prove wrong. Responsible handling of questions is essentially sober language applied live, and it requires practice because the social pressure can be intense. Responsible presentation also includes careful control of what gets written down and distributed, because written statements travel farther than spoken nuance. If you put a specific attribution label in a written summary, it may be forwarded, repeated, and remembered without the context you provided verbally. That can create organizational momentum around a claim that is still evolving. A responsible approach is to ensure written communication distinguishes between confirmed facts, supported assessments, and open questions, and that attribution is placed in the assessment category with an appropriate confidence statement. You also want to ensure that the written message emphasizes what actions are being taken and what actions are needed, so the organization does not fixate on the name. This is not about hiding information. It is about preventing misinterpretation as the message travels. Leaders are often grateful for this discipline later because it reduces the risk of contradictory statements across teams. In many incidents, messaging consistency is itself a form of risk control. You should also be aware of the audience boundaries when presenting attribution, because different audiences have different tolerances and different consequences. Executive leadership may need a high-level understanding of likely behavior and risk implications, while legal and communications teams may care about how attribution language affects obligations and external statements. Technical teams may need more detail to drive detection and response, but they also need discipline to avoid overlinking and overclaiming. Responsible presentation means you adjust depth without changing the underlying truth, keeping the core message consistent across audiences. It also means you are aware that some audiences may treat attribution as a trigger for certain actions, such as contacting partners or engaging external support. That is why confidence calibration matters, because it helps prevent irreversible steps from being taken on weak support. Presenting responsibly is essentially aligning the message to the consequences of the audience's actions. Another important element is making sure attribution does not displace lessons learned about exposure and control gaps, because leaders can become distracted by the idea of a powerful adversary. If leaders believe a famous or sophisticated actor was involved, they may assume the organization could not have prevented the incident, which can reduce urgency for fixing basic weaknesses. Responsible presentation keeps the focus on what enabled the intrusion, such as an exposed service, weak identity controls, or insufficient monitoring, because those factors are what the organization can change. Attribution can still be included, but it should not become an excuse or a centerpiece that overshadows the real defensive improvements needed. This is where models like the cyber kill chain, CKC, are helpful, because they remind everyone that intrusions succeed through chains of steps that can be disrupted. When you present attribution alongside the chain of behaviors and the control gaps, you encourage leaders to invest in improvements that will reduce risk regardless of which adversary appears next. That is responsible because it leads to better security outcomes over time. Responsible presentation also means creating a path for updates, because attribution assessments are not static. As new evidence arrives, you may strengthen the linkage, reduce confidence in an earlier hypothesis, or discover that the activity is part of a broader campaign. Leaders should not be surprised by these shifts, because surprises create distrust. You can prevent that by explicitly stating that attribution is being tracked and may be refined as additional telemetry and external context become available. You can also explain what types of evidence would cause an update, such as discovering additional infrastructure overlap, identifying distinctive procedure-level behaviors, or receiving corroborating reports. This sets expectations that the organization is in a learning process, not a guessing process. It also gives leaders permission to make decisions based on current best knowledge while remaining open to revision. Responsible presentation makes uncertainty manageable by bounding it and by communicating the update mechanism. As we wrap up, presenting attribution responsibly to decision makers means treating attribution as a decision support input, not as the headline of the incident. You begin by grounding the conversation in confirmed incident facts and current status. Then you introduce attribution as a bounded assessment with clear confidence and clear relevance to expected adversary behavior. You distinguish linkage from identity, tie attribution to practical implications, and explain the downside risk of over-reliance on a claim that could evolve. You handle pressure for certainty by redirecting to observed behaviors and impacts, and you control written messaging so nuance is not lost as information spreads. You adjust depth to audience needs without changing the truth, and you ensure attribution does not distract from the control gaps that must be fixed to prevent recurrence. Finally, you set expectations for updates so changes in assessment feel normal rather than contradictory. When you do all of this consistently, leaders can act decisively with a clear understanding of what is known, what is uncertain, and what actions will reduce risk regardless of the adversary's name.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.